Paul lived at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, far enough to enjoy peace but still close enough to be under the rules of the homeowners association. He had bought his land 10 years earlier because of the creek that ran along the back of his property. The creek looked beautiful during the summer, with clear water reflecting the sun, dragonflies darting over the surface, and small fish swimming between the stones. Children from nearby houses often came to skip rocks, and Paul did not mind. He liked seeing people enjoy the water as much as he did. But the creek was not always gentle. In spring and during heavy rains, the water rose quickly, rushing with strong force. Paul had seen how it ate away at the soil on his land year after year. Small pieces of his yard fell into the water, and the edge of his barn became dangerously close to the eroded bank. He patched the soil, placed stones, and even tried planting strong grass to hold the ground, but nothing lasted. Each season the water returned with even more strength. One stormy night, Paul stood at the window of his barn with a lantern in hand. He watched as the creek swelled and beat against the bank. He felt fear that the barn might not last much longer. That was the moment he decided he had to do something permanent. If the water could not be stopped, it had to be controlled. Paul spent weeks planning. He walked along the creek, studying how the current moved. He took notes about where the water was strongest and where the bank was weakest. He sketched small designs in a notebook. He read books about water flow and even visited the town library to learn how dams worked. He was not an engineer, but he had a good mind for building. His father had taught him carpentry and stonework, and Paul believed he could make something strong enough to hold. By the time spring ended, he had a plan. He would build a small dam, not high like the giant dams that blocked rivers, but strong enough to slow the creek. His design would let water pass through slowly, turning the wild rush into a steady stream. Behind the dam, a pond would form, calm and still. That pond would catch the extra rainwater and stop it from flooding his land. Paul began gathering materials. He hauled heavy stones from the nearby hill and cut timber from fallen trees. He worked alone most days, starting early in the morning and finishing late in the evening. His clothes grew wet with sweat, and his hands grew rough from lifting. Still, he felt proud each time he placed another stone or locked another log into position. Some neighbors came to watch. A woman named Helen stopped one afternoon while walking her dog. "That looks like hard work, Paul," she said. He wiped his brow and smiled. "It is, but it will keep the water from taking my land. It may even help the whole street. The creek floods more than just my yard." Helen nodded and wished him luck. Another neighbor, Tom, brought his son to see the project. The boy's eyes lit up as he looked at the rising wall of stones and timber. "Is this going to make a lake?" he asked with excitement. Paul chuckled. "Not a lake, but a nice pond. You might see ducks swimming here soon." The neighbors admired his effort, but the board of the homeowners association remained silent. They did not come to visit or ask questions, which Paul found strange but not concerning. He believed that once they saw the finished project, they would understand its value. Weeks turned into months. Piece by piece, the dam took shape. At last, Paul stood on the bank and looked at his work with pride. The creek, once wild and noisy, now slowed as it reached the dam. Water passed through the gaps between stones, steady and calm. Behind the wall, a clear pond stretched across his land. Sunlight danced on the surface, and reeds already began to grow along the edges. It did not take long for nature to accept the change. Ducks landed on the pond, dipping their heads into the water. Fish swam in the still depths. Dragonflies hovered like small jewels above the surface. For the first time in years, Paul felt at peace when rain clouds gathered, because the water no longer rushed to destroy his soil. The dam did more than protect his barn. It made the neighborhood prettier. Children now came to watch the ducks. Couples strolled by the water's edge during evenings. Even Tom's boy tried fishing in the pond one afternoon, though he caught nothing but weeds. Paul smiled at the joy his work brought to others. Yet beneath that joy, a shadow waited. One morning, Paul found a letter in his mailbox. The envelope carried the seal of the Homeowners Association. He opened it at his kitchen table and read the words slowly, each line striking him like a hammer. The letter declared that he had built an unapproved structure on community land. It claimed that the dam violated rules of property use and safety. At the bottom of the page, in bold letters, was the fine, $10,000. Paul set the letter down and stared out the window at the pond. The water shone in the morning sun. He thought of the nights he had labored with stone and timber, the sweat he had poured into protecting his home, the joy of neighbors who admired his work. And now, the very people who should have been thankful were punishing him instead. His first feeling was disbelief. His second was anger. He had built something that helped not only himself but also the entire community. The creek no longer flooded the street during storms, and yet the board chose to see it as a crime. Paul folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it aside. He knew he would not ignore this. He would stand before the board and speak his truth. If they could not see reason, then they would learn from the water itself. For now, he went outside and sat by the pond. A pair of ducks glided across the surface, leaving ripples that spread in soft circles. Paul listened to the gentle sound of water trickling through the dam. In that moment, he felt both proud and challenged. His battle with the creek had ended, but a new battle with the HOA had only just begun. Paul carried the letter with him all day. Even while tending his barn and feeding his animals, the words from the Homeowners Association circled in his mind. $10,000 was not just a fine, it was an insult. The board acted as if his dam was a crime, while he knew it was a shield against damage. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table again, reading the letter under the yellow glow of the lamp. At the bottom, in clear instructions, the board had written that he must attend the next community meeting if he wished to dispute the penalty. Paul was not a man who liked arguments. He enjoyed his peace, his work, and the company of honest neighbors. But this was too much to ignore. The dam was his sweat, his safety, and his pride. He could not let others tear it down with papers and rules. He made up his mind to attend the meeting. The meeting was held in the community hall, a building with polished floors, tall windows, and rows of chairs. On the night of the meeting, Paul walked in carrying the letter in his hand. Neighbors filled the seats, whispering among themselves. Some nodded at him, some looked away, and a few wore worried faces, as if they already knew trouble was coming. At the front sat the board members, 5 in total. The head of the board, Greg, wore a suit and tie even though it was a casual gathering. His voice carried authority, but also pride. Next to him sat a woman named Clara, who kept her papers stacked neatly in front of her. The others shifted in their seats, waiting for the meeting to begin. Greg tapped his folder and spoke loudly. "We will begin. Tonight we have several matters, but the most important is the violation on Riverbend property, owned by Paul." His words drew every eye toward Paul, who sat calmly in the third row. Greg continued. "This so-called dam, built without approval, goes against the association rules. It poses risks to safety and appearance. The board has issued a fine of $10,000 and demands removal. Murmurs spread among the crowd. Some neighbors frowned, others raised their brows in surprise. Paul stood slowly, holding the letter in his hand. His voice was steady as he spoke. I built the dam to stop the creek from eating away at my land. Every storm was a threat. Now the water is calm. The pond helps not just me but all of you. It stops flooding. It brings beauty. The ducks, the fish, the safety of the street, it is all better now. He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. I worked with my own hands. I did not ask for money or help. I only wanted to protect my barn and keep my home safe. Clara leaned forward, folding her hands. Paul, we understand your concern, but the rules are clear. No major structure may be built without board approval. This is not about beauty or effort. It is about following the process. Paul shook his head. What process kept the water from flooding? What rule held the soil when the creek tore it away? I warned before, I say again now, without that dam, the water will return stronger. It will not only take my land, it will reach the street. Greg smirked slightly, as if amused. The creek is nature. We cannot allow individuals to change the landscape for personal use. Rules keep order. Without them, anyone would do as they wish, and chaos would follow. The fine stands. For a moment, silence filled the hall. Paul looked around. He saw Helen, who had once praised his work, now staring down at her shoes. He saw Tom, who had brought his son to watch the pond, now shifting uncomfortably but saying nothing. The crowd was filled with people who had enjoyed the dam but feared the board. Paul felt the weight of their silence. He realized that they would not speak for him. They were too careful, too afraid of losing favor with the board. He alone must carry his voice. He stepped closer to the front. I do not fear your fine. I do not fear your words. But remember this. When the water rises and the streets are under flood, it will not be me who is to blame. It will be your pride, your refusal to listen. Greg's eyes narrowed. He did not enjoy being challenged. Are you threatening us, Paul? Paul stood tall. No, I am warning you. Nature does not bend to paper rules. It answers only to balance. The dam brought balance. Without it, you will face the water yourselves. The board whispered among themselves for a moment. Clara adjusted her glasses and spoke again. The decision remains. You have 30 days to remove the dam. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Gasps rose from the crowd. Legal action was no small matter. Paul's jaw tightened, but he did not argue further. He folded the letter in half, tucked it into his pocket, and turned to leave. As he walked down the aisle, the crowd parted. Some neighbors avoided his eyes, but others looked at him with quiet sympathy. Outside the hall, the night air was cool. Paul breathed deeply, letting the anger inside him settle into calm resolve. They had made their choice, and now he would make his. If they wanted the dam gone, he would remove it. But he knew what would come after. On his way home, he passed the creek. The moon shone on the still pond, casting silver light on the water. Ducks slept near the reeds, and fish rippled the surface. It was peaceful, almost magical. Paul stopped for a moment, looking at what he had built with his hands. He whispered softly, though no one was there to hear, they do not know what they ask for. The following days, Paul prepared himself. He gathered his tools, gloves, and ropes. He did not tell his neighbors when he would begin. He knew some would stop him out of fear, while others would watch silently. But the work was his, and the choice was his. Each time he looked at the dam, he felt both sadness and determination. It had taken months to build, and in a short time it would be gone. Yet in his heart, Paul knew this was not an end. It was the start of something greater, something the board could not yet imagine. For now, he waited. The creek flowed gently against the stones, unaware that soon the wall would fall. Paul's mind replayed the words of the meeting again and again. The board demanded obedience, but they had ignored wisdom. When the water was free once more, the lesson would be written not in letters or fines but in the streets of the very people who had turned their backs. The 30 days given by the board passed slowly, yet with each sunrise Paul felt the weight of their demand pressing closer. He had lived many years in peace, working on his land, raising his barn, and watching the seasons change along the creek. Now he felt like a stranger in his own neighborhood, judged by papers and rules that ignored truth. On the 30th morning, Paul rose early. The sky was pale with dawn, and mist floated over the pond behind his dam. The water was calm, smooth as glass, and ducks glided across its surface. For a long time, Paul stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the beauty he had created. It felt almost wrong to destroy it. Yet the board had made their order clear. If he resisted, they would drag him into courts, drowning him in costs heavier than the fine itself. Paul gathered his tools. He placed ropes, an iron hook, and a heavy hammer into his wheelbarrow. His gloves were worn from the months of building, but they would serve one more time. Step by step, he walked to the creek and set the tools on the ground. The dam stood proudly, a wall of stone and timber that had resisted storms and floods. It looked strong enough to last for years, but its fate was sealed by prideful words, not nature's will. Paul tightened his gloves and began. He started with the timbers at the edge, pulling out the smaller pieces that locked the wall together. Each log was heavy, damp from months of holding back water. He dragged them onto the bank, stacking them in a pile. The sound of wood scraping against stone echoed through the morning air. As the first gap opened, water pushed eagerly through, rushing with a force that reminded him of the creek's true nature. He paused, listening to the roar that grew louder with every piece he removed. The compound behind the dam began to stir, ripples spreading outward. Fish darted in confusion, and ducks flapped their wings, startled by the change. Paul worked steadily, his arms straining with effort. Sweat ran down his back though the morning air was cool. Every stone he shifted felt like a memory being undone. He remembered the long days of carrying rocks from the hill, the evenings when he had wiped dust from his brow while admiring his progress, the quiet pride of shaping something that served both him and the land. Now, all of it was being taken apart, stone by stone. By midday, a larger section of the wall was gone. The creek, no longer fully blocked, surged forward. Water crashed over the broken edge, spraying mist into the air. Paul stepped back, watching as the pond began to lower. The ducks quacked in alarm and took to the sky. The reeds bent under the sudden pull of current. What had once been peaceful was becoming wild again. Neighbors began to gather. Helen stood at the edge of her yard, shading her eyes as she watched. Tom walked over with his son, who clutched his father's hand tightly. More people appeared, drawn by the sound of rushing water. Some whispered, others stood in silence. None offered help. "Are you really taking it down?" Helen called out. Paul nodded, his face calm though his heart felt heavy. "The board ordered it?" They gave me no choice. Tom's son tugged at his sleeve. But the ducks, the fish, the pond. They will all be gone. Paul gave the boy a sad smile. Sometimes people must see loss before they understand what they had. The crowd stayed as Paul worked into the afternoon. With every strike of his hammer, with every log rolled aside, the creak grew louder. The pond shrank, its stillness broken. By late afternoon, only half the dam remained. Water poured through the gaps like a beast finally freed from its cage. At last, Paul pulled the final log loose. With a deep groan, the wall gave way. Stones tumbled into the current, vanishing under white foam. The creek roared with full strength, a sound of raw power echoing through the neighborhood. The pond drained quickly, leaving behind mud, reeds, and stranded fish flipping helplessly until they found the rushing water again. The neighbors gasped as the full force of the creek tore forward. The current carved new paths along the bank, ripping away soil and branches. Paul stood still, his gloves wet, his shirt soaked with sweat. He felt no triumph in this moment, only a calm certainty. He had done what was demanded. Now nature would do what it always did, follow its own course. The crowd slowly drifted away, their faces uneasy. They had wanted to see what would happen, but the truth unsettled them. Paul gathered his tools, placing them back into the wheelbarrow. He looked once more at the creek, now wild and fierce again, before turning toward his barn. That night, Paul sat on his porch. The air was heavy with the smell of wet soil, and the sound of rushing water filled the silence of the neighborhood. He thought about the bored, sitting in their houses, certain they had won. But Paul knew better. They had not defeated him. They had only invited a lesson far greater than any words he could speak. The sky darkened, and distant thunder rolled across the hills. Paul's eyes followed the heavy clouds moving closer. He knew rain was coming, the kind that would test the strength of every street, yard, and foundation in the neighborhood. Without the dam, there was nothing to slow the water. He leaned back in his chair, hands resting on his knees, and listened to the creek's roar. It was no longer a gentle friend, no longer a balanced stream. It was a restless force waiting for the storm to feed it. Paul felt a strange calm in his chest. He had done his part, and he had given fair warning. Whatever happened next would be a truth written by the water itself. The night after Paul removed the dam, the sky turned restless. Clouds rolled across the hills, dark and heavy, covering the moon with a thick blanket. The air smelled of rain, and a sharp wind bent the trees near the creek. Paul sat on his porch with his lantern glowing beside him. He listened to the roar of the water, now free and wild, no longer slowed by the stones and timber he had placed with care. By midnight, the first drops began to fall. At first, the rain was gentle, tapping against the roof and the leaves. But soon the sound grew louder, until it became a steady drum that shook the ground. Paul rose to his feet and walked to the edge of his land. The creek, already restless, swelled quickly as the rain poured in. He watched the current leap higher, striking the banks with violent force. Across the neighborhood, lights flickered in houses as families peered from their windows. The storm had woken them. Some stood on their porches, worried, while others stepped into the rain to look at the growing water. They had grown used to the compound Paul's dam had created, and many had forgotten the true nature of the creek. Now, they were about to remember. Within an hour, the creek spilled over its banks. Water rushed across the low ground, spreading into lawns and gardens. The neat fences and flower beds built near the water vanished under the rising flood. Cars parked on the roadside sat in water up to their wheels. The current found every dip and crack, filling it with unstoppable force. Paul stood firm on his porch, his barn standing safe behind him. His land, higher and protected, remained untouched by the flood. The dam had once been his shield, but even without it, his position kept him safe. The rest of the neighborhood was not so lucky. By 2 in the morning, the streets had become rivers. Neighbors scrambled with buckets and sandbags, trying to protect their garages and front doors. The sound of shouting mixed with the roar of the storm. Children cried as parents rushed to carry them upstairs. Dogs barked from porches as water crept closer. The once calm neighborhood had turned into a place of fear. Paul could see it all from where he stood. He had warned them many times. He had spoken clearly at the meeting. He had told them what the dam truly did. But the board had chosen rules over reason, pride over wisdom. Now the water itself was their teacher. Greg, the head of the board, was among those in the streets. He wore boots and a raincoat, shouting orders to anyone who would listen. Move the cars to higher ground. Block the drains. Keep the water back. His voice was strong, but his face carried fear. For all his authority, he could not command the flood. Clara, who always spoke of rules, stood beside him, clutching an umbrella that bent in the wind. Her papers and folders were nowhere to be seen, for paper had no power against the storm. At one point, Helen ran to Paul's property, her shoes splashing through water. "Paul, it is worse than we thought. The streets are drowning. Is there nothing we can do?" Paul looked at her with calm eyes. The dam was already doing it. But it is gone now. Helen's face fell. She turned back toward her home, understanding too late that the fight had never been against Paul. It had always been against the creek, and now the creek was winning. The rain continued without mercy. By dawn, the neighborhood looked like a lake. Cars stood half submerged. Lawns were gone under muddy water. The storm drains overflowed, unable to carry the weight. Some houses had water rising into their ground floors, soaking carpets and furniture. Families huddled on second levels, watching helplessly as their homes filled with flood water. Paul moved through his barn, checking that his animals were dry and safe. They were calm, untouched by the chaos outside. He gave them hay and fresh water, then returned to his porch. He felt no joy in the suffering of his neighbors, but he also felt no guilt. He had done what he could. He had built something that kept the flood at bay. They had demanded its removal. Now they faced the truth. By morning, the board gathered again, not in the hall but in the streets, their boots deep in flood water. Greg's coat was soaked, his hair plastered against his head. Clara held her umbrella, now broken and useless. The other members looked tired and defeated. Together, they walked toward Paul's home, moving slowly through the water. Paul saw them coming and stepped down from his porch to meet them. The board stood before him, clothes dripping, faces pale. For once, Greg had no commanding tone. His voice was lower, almost humble. "Paul," he said, "we were wrong. The dam was not a violation. It was protection. We see that now." Clara added, "The fine is gone. We will cancel it completely. We ask you to help us rebuild the barrier. The neighborhood needs it." Neighbors gathered behind the board, their eyes filled with hope. They looked at Paul not with judgment now, but with respect, even regret. They had seen what life without the dam truly meant. Paul studied them for a long moment. He thought of the long days he had spent building, the pride he had felt when the pond was full, the peace it had brought to the creek. He also thought of the silence at the meeting, when no one had spoken for him. He had carried the work alone before, and he knew he could do it again. "I will build again," he said finally, "but this time it will be on my terms. If you want the dam back, then you will stand beside me. You will carry stones, you will lift timber, and you will learn what it means to work with the water, not against it." Greg nodded quickly. "We will help. We must help." The neighbors, though tired, gave small cheers. Hope returned to their faces. The storm still raged, the flood still covered their streets, but now they had seen the truth. They understood that rules and pride could not protect them. Only unity, effort, and respect for nature could. Paul turned back to the roaring creek, now overflowing with the force of the storm. His eyes were steady, his heart strong. The lesson had been written clearly in the streets of the neighborhood. The dam had been more than stone and timber. It had been balance, and without it, there was only chaos. The rain began to ease as the sun broke faintly through the clouds. Paul knew the water would take days to settle, and the damage would remain for months. But in that moment, standing before his neighbors, he also knew something else. The flood had washed away more than fences and flowers. It had washed away blindness. Now the community saw what he had seen from the beginning. The storm passed slowly, leaving the neighborhood covered in silence broken only by dripping water and the distant call of crows. Streets that once carried children on bicycles now held mud and debris. Cars stood tilted in pools of brown water, fences leaned half-broken, and lawns were hidden under thick layers of silt. Families stepped out of their homes, tired but thankful that the worst of the rain had ended. Paul stood on his porch, watching as neighbors surveyed the damage. He could see them carrying ruined carpets, dragging broken furniture, and sweeping mud from their doorways. The air was heavy with the smell of wet wood and damp soil. Though his land remained safe, Paul felt the weight of their loss. He had warned them, and they had refused to listen, but he was not a man who took joy in another's pain. Later that morning, the board returned to his property. Greg's fine suit was ruined, and Clara's hair was tied back with strands of mud still clinging to it. The other members followed with weary faces. This time, there was no pride, no papers, no folders. Only humility. "Paul," Greg began, his voice rough, "you were right. We should have listened. The dam was not just your project. It was protection for all of us. We want to make things right." Paul studied their faces. He could see the truth in their eyes now. They had felt the strength of the creek without balance, and it had humbled them. Around them, neighbors gathered, waiting for his answer. "You say you want to make things right," Paul said slowly, "then understand this. I will not carry the work alone again. If the dam is to rise once more, every one of you will put your hands to it. You will lift stone, you will carry timber, and you will learn what it means to work with nature, not against it." There was silence for a moment. Then Clara spoke softly. "We will help. We have no choice if we want to live here in peace." Tom stepped forward from the crowd, his son at his side. "I will carry stones with you, Paul. My boy still talks about the ducks. He wants them back." Helen raised her hand. "I will bring food and water for those who work. We cannot undo the flood, but we can build something better." One by one, others stepped forward, offering hands, tools, and time. For the first time, Paul saw real unity among his neighbors. The flood had washed away fear and pride. In its place, it had left resolve. The very next day, work began. Paul guided them, showing how the stones should be placed, how the timbers should be cut and locked together, how the wall must be shaped to bend with the water's force instead of fighting it. Men carried heavy rocks from the hill. Women tied ropes around logs and dragged them into place. Children, eager to help, gathered smaller stones and stacked them into piles. The sound of hammers and voices filled the air. Where once the board had argued in meetings, now they sweated under the sun, carrying stones with the same hands that had signed fines. Greg himself hauled timber alongside Tom, his pride stripped away by the lessons of the flood. Clara, who had once spoken only of rules, now bent her back with the others, learning that strength was built through labor, not paper. Days turned into weeks. The dam rose again, stronger and taller than before. With many hands working together, the progress was faster than Paul had ever managed alone. At night, lanterns glowed by the water as they worked late, determined to finish before the next heavy rain. Neighbors who once avoided one another now shared stories, laughter, and bread as they rested by the creek. One evening, Tom's son pointed at the growing pond behind the half-finished wall. "Look, father. The ducks are back." Everyone turned to see two ducks gliding across the water. A cheer rose from the workers, and hope shone on their tired faces. Paul watched all of this with quiet pride. He did not need to shout or command. He only guided, and the community followed. He knew that this dam was more than a wall of stone and timber now. It was a bond of unity, a promise written in sweat and effort. At last, after weeks of hard work, the dam was complete. The creek slowed once again, flowing steady and calm into the pond. The water sparkled in the sunlight, reflecting reeds, dragonflies, and the proud faces of those who had built it together. The neighborhood gathered on the bank, clapping and cheering, their voices carrying across the hills. Greg stepped forward, wiping dirt from his hands. "Paul," he said, "you gave us a gift once, and we threw it away. This time, we built it with you. We will never forget the lesson." Paul nodded. "The creek will always be here. Storms will always come. But as long as you remember to respect the water and work together, you will never fear it again." From that day on, the dam was no longer called Paul's Dam. It was known as the Riverbend Dam, a name chosen by the neighbors themselves. Children played by the pond, fishermen cast lines, and families picnicked by the shore. The water no longer brought fear. It brought life. The board also changed. They no longer ruled with pride or strict rules alone. Instead, they listened to voices, considered wisdom, and remembered the flood that had humbled them. The fine that once hung over Paul's head became a forgotten memory, replaced by respect. Years later, when storms returned and the rain poured heavy, the dam stood firm. The pond filled, but the streets remained safe. Families watched the water rise calmly, no longer afraid. They spoke of the time when they had ignored Paul's warnings and paid the price, and they taught their children to listen to wisdom, no matter who spoke it. Paul grew older, but whenever he walked by the dam, neighbors greeted him warmly. They remembered his patience, his strength, and his warning. He was no longer just a man at the edge of the neighborhood. He was the one who had shown them the truth, and the dam was his legacy. The creek continued to flow, as it always had. But now it flowed under the watchful eyes of a community that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that pride cannot hold back water, but unity can.